So as you go away from the equator, you rely more on animal foods and people are taller. And so as we go north, these Scandinavian countries are the tallest and they're eating heavily animal-based diets. So people in Southeast Asia are the shortest and they're relying most on rice and just these cheap filler foods. So that's how they developed these shorter genes. So it is genetic, but it's also based on nutrition. These genetics and epigenetics
working together.
Yes, this study included a map of the world, and closer to the equator, it's low animal food, and closer to the north and some of the south, higher animal food, and that was exact correlation to height.
Now, today's show with Brian Sanders is brought to you by Myoscience. As you can tell, we're talking about the importance of healthy, whole, real foods and how different nutrients in animal products, as well as healthy whole foods, can support your health. And one tool that I found to be very helpful with my clients is Berberine Fasting Accelerator to help support their metabolic health and also gain control over food cravings. What makes berberine unique is it's been used in traditional Chinese medicine for over 3,000 years. There's now 17 randomized controlled trials in humans demonstrating that berberine hydrochloride, again, which is a natural product found in nature, how it supports metabolic health and may also help with food cravings. That's how I found it to be effective for myself back in 2015. I found that when I was taking berberine, it increased my ketones and I had a better control over appetite, and I was less inclined to crave some ice cream, cookies, and sweets after dinner. So if you want to optimize your metabolic health, you can go to myoscience.com and use the code podcast to save. Again, that's myoscience with the code podcast to save. So let's cut back to it with Brian. So Brian Sanders, you've been studying human nutrition for the better part of 10 years. What aspect of your health or what motivated you to start studying nutrition?
Man, yeah, I was about 30 when this all happened. I'm 41 as of last week. And at 30, that's kind of the time when you can't eat whatever you want anymore.
Yeah.
You know, I was getting the dad bod. I had all these conditions. I started taking like medications. I was going to turn into the standard American. And at the same time, actually, I lost both my parents. So yeah, it was very devastating. My dad had cancer, my mom Alzheimer's, and she had this terrible progression of 10 years of struggle. And we actually just lost her 2 months ago, finally.
Sorry.
So yeah, that woke me up. You know, this is my new mission in life, was to figure out what should I eat, right? Why did these chronic diseases catch up with so many people? Why are 88% of Americans metabolically unhealthy? And I think the foundation of that is nutrition. And of course, there's the other lifestyle factors. And, you know, everyone probably listening knows about movement, sun, sleep, community. But nutrition matters most. And yeah, that's where I got started. And 7 years ago, I started full-time making a documentary series about this. Nice. And I was a mechanical engineer previously, and I was in tech before, and I kind of just wanted to leave it all behind and just go all in. And it's taken me some crazy places.
That's amazing. It seems like a lot of engineers get gravitated towards this line of work because you're able to look at data and research, and you have an unbiased lens through which you're viewing different studies and experimenting with different, dietary methods yourself. I like that you're pretty dietary agnostic at this point. Have you dabbled with vegan or vegetarianism or the fruitarian diet? And if so, what did you notice when you were dabbling?
Those are the only 3 diets I haven't tried. I've kind of tried them all, but very early I realized the importance of animal foods, and it was just always instinctual to me to eat them. So I've tried everything else. And it's funny because my whole life we were raised on the food pyramid, the healthy American diet, not the standard American fast food. We did not eat fast food very much at all. It was a big treat to go to a fast food place once in a while. We cooked all our own food. But that's part of my story, is that I saw my parents try to do it. I saw myself try to do it. I was in my late 20s, going on 30, cooking the food pyramid at home, not going out to eat. Yeah. Right? Cooking the food, like doing everything right, low fat, whole grains, avoiding red meat, lean chicken. I was doing it, and I was becoming a mess. All like joint issues, acid reflux, problems with my arms, overuse injuries, allergies, extra 25 pounds of fat. And that all went away when I changed my diet. And yeah, so Not tried the plant-based ones though.
I dabbled with that in 2006 to 2008, and I found I had just had a lot of GI issues. And I've worked with clients over the years who similarly have gone vegan or vegetarian for various different reasons, whether it's, the well-being of animals or their own health. And they've heard, because now there's so many documentaries foisting the plant-based agenda on individuals. It's very confusing for people. I just met people just yesterday at Barton Springs who were both fruitarians for a while, and then started to notice they were gaining weight and having insulin resistance issues, and then turned a little bit more towards a whole food omnivorous style diet, which I want to get into with you. But getting back to your upbringing, so you're eating foods at home. This was in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. It seems that from people that I know that are Tongan or Samoan that live in Hawaii still, the obesity and chronic disease rates are pretty high out there. Why is that?
Yeah. So we're putting this some of this info in the Food Lies series as well. It's really interesting because a lot of people won't blame the food, and they'll say, "Oh, well, it's because we're sedentary or we're working in offices and all this type of stuff." And I actually looked at Tonga and Samoa specifically, and there's some mini documentaries about them, and we found all this great footage, and looked at these kind of more anecdotal little stories. And these people are doing all the things right. They are outside working in the fields, right? This is back in Tonga, not in Hawaii.
Yeah.
But they're doing all the things right, but they still are massively overweight, obese, type 2 diabetes, all these things. It's a huge problem. These islands have the highest rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes, like almost in the world, I think. So it's one part of it is because I think it's their genes are not ready for this rapid switch that happens a lot, even with the Native Americans. Native Americans have a lot of problems, or with alcohol too, right? It's this massive influx of processed foods or alcohol, and they don't have kind of the genetics and the epigenetics to handle it. But the interesting part to me was that it really shows how much the food matters, because that's what changed the most. And same thing in Hawaii. They kind of eat similar foods in Hawaii. Their plate lunches, everything's fried, bunch of fried food and seed oils. There's tons of rice. I've gone full circle on rice though. I gave up rice, I lost a lot of weight. It's one of the things I gave up. And now I'm back. I'm like, I can have a little white rice, in a correct amount. But people in Hawaii, people in these islands, they're eating tons of starchy foods, tons of kind of empty calories, macaroni salad, right? It's just like pasta noodles with mayonnaise, terrible, fried everything, and just a smaller portion of meat. And that's if on a good day, right? This is like a healthy meal. It's like, we got a plate lunch. This is at least it's not fast food, but this is what people are eating, and this is really, really not serving them.
And so in Tonga and Samoa, is there a lot of processed foods being imported there?
Yeah, so that's what happened, because they were eating naturally. They were fit. So we have this idea that these people are just overweight type of people. Yeah. That is not true. This is also something we found. The people who are doing the traditional diets, lean, strong, tall, everyone muscular. Was very good looking, muscular, yeah.
Wild. And so it happens very quickly. I mean, just a couple of generations, and then you have rampant obesity in children. And yeah, we went out and got some barbecue last night at the Salt Lick, and there was a lot of Hispanic families, and they were having meat, but then also it was soda, it was the pastries and
mac and cheese,
the bread. So it's very interesting, sort of transitioning to epidemiological studies that find that red meat consumption is linked with all these different ailments. But when you look for what do people eat along with red meat, it's mac and cheese, it's potato salad, it's the bread and sugar and things like that. What do you make of these studies that have come out? There was the twin study by Chris Gardner over at Stanford. Mm-hmm. And then also last fall, Harvard Walter Willett et al. Put out a study finding that red meat consumption is linked with increased rates of diabetes. So for the average person who's not able to look into the studies, and look at what are they adjusting for or what have you, it's really confusing. How do you convey this in your documentaries, and what do you tell people?
Yeah, it's hard. We're fighting an uphill battle, and all the big films that have been made are vegan, right? It's the Game Changers, it's the What the Health, it's Cowspiracy back in the day. There's all these, and those are the only ones that seem to make it to the mainstream. And I always get a little conspiratorial. Like, why are these the only ones that make it? I think there's a lot of money in it.
Yeah.
And So I think that's one of the biggest answers is there's a lot of money in it. And I have a quick side story. I tried to start a meat company. Well, I did. It's called Nose to Tail, and we do regenerative ag, and I thought it'd be great, right? I have an audience that loves meat, and then I realized there's no profit margin on meat. There's no profit margin on any whole foods, and so after 3 or 4 years of it, we stopped selling meat as of a month ago because I'm just losing money. And then I was like, okay, that's just how the world works. The world works on the high profit margin on processed foods. There's just this fact of nature. There's a law of nature that if you, also subsidies from the government and make it even cheaper,
that
right?
helps a little bit.
Corn, wheat, soy subsidies. But just in general, you can process down plant foods, right? Specifically sort of monocrops like empty filler type foods, corn, wheat, soy. And you can repackage them and make a lot of money on it. Huge profit margin. With that profit margin, you can do fake studies, you can do lobbying, and you can do trillions of dollars in marketing, right, over the years, right? And then you control the narrative. So no one selling strawberries or lettuce or meat is going to ever have that profit margin, and they're never going to be able to do what the processed food industries do. So that's why we have this, right? There's going to always be some epidemiology that shows this because there's a big agenda, right? And there's more to it. And there's also there's ways to kind of manipulate them. And there's also, I don't think no one is really eating a healthy diet. There's a very small percentage of people. We're here in Austin. There's a lot of people who are actually doing it correctly. But when you look at the world scale, it's less than 1%. I don't even know. Maybe it's a couple percent. We'll give them how many, like, what do you think? People like us, we mentioned Saladino. He's eating meat in a healthy way, right? And he's promoting, it's great. It's getting more popular. There's, I don't know, 1 million people in the U.S.
Maybe. I mean, yeah, or hundreds of thousands. Yeah, it's a small percentage of people. But when you do go to these areas, whether it's LA or Austin or maybe parts of Miami or things like that, where it's very health-centric, you do see relatively lean people who are muscular, fit, no visceral fat, lean in the face, low triglycerides and blood glucose parameters. So yeah, why not study that population? I mean, it seems to me, and I don't want to get too off topic, but epidemiology is sort of like the taxi cab of ride share. Like if you look at like what we are doing, it's like an Uber or Lyft in comparison to how these studies are being done. Epidemiology and these food frequency questionnaires, they're inherently fraught with all sorts of biases and limitations, but we still base our nutrition recommendations on these food frequency questionnaire data that we know are fraught with challenges. And I think the average person doesn't realize that that is how data is collected, and that's how our nutrition recommendations are, and our guidelines are recommended based upon these findings. It seems that there's still this incessant focus on LDL cholesterol changes, and that's the biomarker that is often tracked to say that one diet is better than the other. And we know that if you go on a low carb diet or eat more animal products, that your LDL will likely increase. And at least with the Stanford twin feeding study, that was pretty much the sole biomarker that was used to track whether or not which diet was more effective long term for affecting overall health. So, I'm with you. If you look at the biotech funding and the private equity funding, it is all going towards dairy alternatives, meat alternatives, and protein alternatives, whether it's cricket protein, rice or pea protein, or some sort of bacterial fermentation product. And there's so much money to be made in that right now. And like you said, the logistics of shipping frozen meat across the country or whatever, it's not scalable. There's not a lot of profit in that. So it's unfortunate that, the most effective way, in our opinion, based upon what studies we'll talk about shortly, there's just not a lot of money to be made there. And that's why exercise isn't promoted, or vitamin D, or now nutrition.
It's you always follow the money. It sounds kind of trite, but it's so true. How do we change the system? It's like you have to figure out how to incentivize someone to eat real food, and it doesn't really work. Like there's no real ways. And so everything is hinged on that. And so nothing's going to change, right? And we put all these statistics in the series of that actually the top 4 industries in the U.S. are all sick care, pharma, like, that kind of a system. So why would these people making trillions of dollars all of a sudden change their business model. It makes no sense. No one, they would never do it. So, yeah.
It's wild. And if we just look at the trends in meat consumption, specifically red meat, it's either stayed the same or actually gone down over the past 20 years, yet poultry has increased dramatically. And so I think that's what's interesting is we're still vilifying the red meat, even though for the past 60 years, we've been promoting a low fat, more carb heavy diet. And we're seeing rates now of heart disease reverse, they've gone down, now they're back up. But isn't that interesting how we keep blaming red meat? But if you look at the USDA data, at least in the US, we're eating less red meat than we were in the early or late 1990s.
Yeah, I love that statistic. We're going to put that in the series as well. And it's so obvious. Like if you really zoom out, and I could just give away the message of the series, it's that there's big money and big industry and momentum in blaming red meat for processed foods problems, right? It's so obvious to us because we know we've awakened people listening. They're like, it's so obvious. We've eaten meat for all of history. We've eaten eggs, saturated fat, butter, all these things. We've eaten for all of history. It's so clear to us that it's the processed foods. Yet the mainstream, it's a big scam. That's why it's called food lies. It's the world's biggest scam, is that all the problems are very clearly caused by industrial oils, factory farmed refined sugars, cornstarch, all the processed stuff. Yet the best, it's genius. Blame it. You got to shift the blame. Shift the blame to red meat, and that's what we've seen. And it's still working. People still, the medical schools still teach this. The doctors don't know it.
But people on the streets do know this. If you talk to folks who are first generation from Americans, they come from another country and their family is raised here, almost universally across the board, their family members who start adhering to the standard American diet gain weight. I mean, this is very common. I was just in an long Uber ride with an individual from Syria, an individual from Lebanon. You hear about their friends and family. They come here, they start eating fast food. They start having the muffins and the croissants and all the processed baked goods, and their family members gain weight when they shift off of what they normally ate back in their home country. And I was just in Europe, and I think, it is interesting to see what's going on in Europe. If you look at specifically heart disease prevalence and rates and death, the different causes of mortality in different parts of the world where red meat is still a staple. Even in France, people talk about how, well, it's more red wine, the French paradox in this, but there's a lot of red meat on menus and you see people eating this. You don't see the obesity and the chronic disease and the joint issues. And the top causes of death are skewed in a different manner compared to here. I think that's interesting. And in fact, but they smoke more in Europe. I mean, it blew my mind. I don't know if you've been to Europe recently, but it's wild just how prevalent smoking is in comparison to here in the US, yet you don't see the rates of cardiovascular disease and cardiometabolic related challenges.
Yeah, that's another one. Why I just think nutrition matters most. It's a lot of people have different theories. Like I said, is it because we're sedentary? Is it because it's smoking? But Americans got the message to stop smoking. Yeah. Right now, it's like absurd if you smoke.
Right.
But disease is getting worse. Right. It's very clear that it is the food. And I think the French paradox, or any of these European countries that they're smoking a lot, I think that they're doing so many other things right that yes, it's bad to smoke, but their body can handle it. Right, because they're eating real foods. They're having their community, and they're just even the ingredient list. You're talking about bread. Even if the people come to the U.S. and don't even change their diet that much, they just buy American versions of those foods. They're getting like 5 extra ingredients in their bread. It's not real bread. A lot of the bread in America is considered a confectionery because it has so much sugar in it. It has all these different preservatives in it. It has so much more pesticides on it. Yeah, of course you're gonna do worse.
Yeah, but I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, nutrition really matters, but also the other lifestyle factors, the community. You see people in Europe and even in Canada take time to sit down, chat over coffee, and really eat in groups. I feel like here in the U.S., it's very common for people to eat in isolation while they're watching Instagram on their phone, on a subway, on a train or whatever, or order Uber Eats and fast food and eat that way. And then, in other countries, they're walking so much more. So I think the exercise element is a really big part of it. But, Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Have you looked at the USDA statistics for how much herbicides, pesticides, and insecticides are sprayed on these commodity crops? I mean, we're talking millions of pounds. And so if you're eating these foods, processed foods, treats, Oreos, whatever, you're getting not only the, as you pointed out, nutrient devoid aspects of the food and highly processed carbohydrates, but all the other unwanted chemicals that we now know have, endocrine effects and have transgenerational epigenetic effects and affect fertility and birth rates. It's pretty wild.
It is. It all factors in, yeah. And it's hard to tease it out. And so the easy way is to just avoid all the processed foods anyway. And yeah, I've been on this 10-year journey, and now it's really easy for me to just not want those foods anymore. Yeah. So I don't have to worry about, okay, is it the glyphosate, or is it the fact that it's highly refined, or is it the fact that there's preservatives? Is it food dyes? Is it this? Is it that? Like, I don't care. I'm just not eating any of it.
Right. Along those lines, the argument that a lot of vegans say online is, the reason why we're growing so much corn and sorghum and all these things here in the U.S. and spraying them with Roundup and other herbicides and insecticides is to feed the cattle. And so if we would just stop eating so much red meat, we wouldn't have to have all these monocrops and so forth. And, you've been in the meat industry for several years and so forth. What would you say to that?
And by industry, you mean, I have a little rancher, one family ranch that I work with. Yeah, so it's a decent point. That's why I'm not for factory farming, Yeah. So we do regenerative. So they took actually not Joel Salatin, Alan Savory, right? Alan Savory, world famous guy that started this 30 years ago and my ranchers took his course before anyone knew who he was. And so they move the cattle each day, and they have a grazing plan for the year, and they do things correctly. So yeah, there's a lot of acres of land out there. If anyone's flown, you can look down. There's a lot of land. And yeah, I think we were talking about incentives earlier. You need to change the incentives. If we didn't have the subsidies on the corn, wheat, and soy, then we could have a lot of land that could be used for grazing animals, right? So yeah, I definitely don't want to give the way we do the CAFO system for raising animals a pass, because we can change the system. It's not going to happen overnight, but there is a lot of land. It's theoretically possible. A lot of things would have to change, and we could use that land or even mixed use farms, right? We can have like Gabe Brown does this. I've interviewed him, and he has plant agriculture and no-till, right? He doesn't till up the soil, and he's doing good business. He's profitable business on thousands and thousands of acres. So we can do better. But I always like to encourage people to do what they can afford now. Like, yes, we're going to change the system, and yes, there are some bad things that vegans can bring up about, right, all this corn, wheat, soy is going to feed the cattle, but there's some more nuance there, right? So I don't want to give it a free pass, but I also will, we talk about the nuance, and some of that nuance is that the cattle are very good upcycler of nutrition. They can take low quality food. They can take most of what they eat is not edible. I think it's about 88%. It's the same number as how many people are metabolically unhealthy. But they can take, I think about 88% of their diet is not edible for humans, right? So they will take distillers' grains and use them for feed. They'll take leftover, just the soy products. So actually most of the soy, the more valuable part of soy is the oil. So you could make a case that maybe we shouldn't be eating so much seed oil, some soybean oil, because a lot of that, half of it is going to make seed oils. And then the other half, you have this, I forget what it's called, meal, just soy meal, right? And then that could be used for cattle. But, it's not all the cattle's fault. They're just trying to make an efficient system. And the world runs on profit and efficiencies and stuff, so we need to change that. But I guess the greater point is that cows can take grass and random leftover stuff and make it into a high quality food, even if it's not ideal in a feedlot. That's a better option. If you only have $10 to feed your family, I would say get that cheaper ground beef ahead of a box of mac and cheese.
Yeah, or bread or pasta. Yeah, and in the fall, I think the cattle will chew up the stems of the corn as well, the corn stalk. I mean, there's a lot of repurposing that can go on if we do this right. But is regenerative agriculture scalable, do you think? I mean, it sounds like a really alluring idea, and it seems like the future. And it seems that consumers have shifted the marketplace in a little bit. You go to Whole Foods or even Safeway or whatever, you see grass-fed options, Costco grass-fed, and some of that could be grass pellets or whatever. There's splitting hairs on there, but it seems that the consumers are actually at the grassroots level shifting the system.
They are. Yes, and Gabe Brown told me this about 7 years ago. I called him when I first started Food Lies, and he told me, he said, I can't say who, but there's a major food conglomerate that is contacting me and wanting advice and putting their money where their mouth is and supporting regenerative because they know that there's a consumer demand there. So these people aren't stupid. You know, they want to make money, and if the consumers say, well, we want more grass-fed, then they're going to provide more grass-fed options. Yeah. And yes, so I think there definitely is a way to do regenerative and scale it. And that's why I was talking about how much land there is out there. There is a lot of land, and I was trying to talk to some of these experts about how much land we're actually using for grazing, and it's not that much. Vegans have some crazy numbers, but that's also land that we couldn't use for crops. Like, it's great because cattle, colloquially called cow's a female, can use rocky terrain. They can use all kinds of different land that's not arable, not suitable for crops. So there's a lot of land out there, and yes, we could do it. I know some people that have done the math. Right. And it's possible to feed the world.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see cattle on BLM land out in the mountains. I mean, I see this all the time in the summer. They run, ranchers will run cattle out in the middle of nowhere, and they're similar to goats in the way that they'll just eat some of the ground cover, up in the mountains, and then come back down in the fall, and they'll be moved somewhere else. So that's certainly doable. It does seem like a lot of work, and I think it would be more profitable to just have a plot of soy or whatever, slash and burn some trees, and then you have soy or corn or whatever. So it seems like that is the push, and then the incentives, to from the subsidies, really. If you're a rancher or a farmer and you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, it seems like that would be the better option, sadly. And then so much land is being acquired by conglomerates related to Bill Gates and other folks. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, yeah, I don't even blame some of these guys because they're just seeing how to make money, and we need to change the system. And I still don't have all the answers to that, but I just know it's possible because we used to do it. The world used to be fed somewhat regeneratively. Like that was our only option. I think we have to just, so part of it is a consumer demand, and part of it is waking people up. Maybe if people really at the top realize, although I also have this theory that people at the top, there's kind of this law of nature. I'm really into really zooming out and looking at the world and laws of nature, and you can't really cheat nature. I've found it's like you pretty much look at all the problems in society, they kind of happen when you go away from nature. I call it decoupling from nature. So processed food is a great example of that. Is we thought that we could take apart food, put it back together, and maybe it has the same macros, but it's not the same nutrition. It's not going to work, right? So that's what humans try to do. And we, maybe it was 1920s, 30s. We're like, oh, this is great technology. We can store foods. Is the wars, and we're going to have a long shelf life, and this is great technology. And everyone got really excited about it. But then we didn't know the consequences, and we're finally seeing that now. Is if you eat, as you increase these in your diet, you get unhealthier and unhealthier, and so the unintended consequences of this. So I don't know which came first. It's like the greed and the power, or the, what. But we ended up here, and so that's decoupling from nature, right? So the food, but that happens with everything in society. If you're just on your phone all day, that's decoupling from nature because you're trying to use social media instead of having real interaction, right? Any problem, you could see how when you go away from how we used to be, you're screwed, right? And so one of the biggest law of nature that I found, or one of the worst ones that's affecting society, is this law that what's good for the top what's good for the rulers, what's good for the top 1%, is almost always bad for the bottom. And what's good for the bottom is almost always bad for the top. Right? It's like there's this natural like kind of hierarchy, and it goes back to even the pharaohs and the slaves. What's good for the pharaoh is feeding slaves a bunch of cheap grains and having them do all the work for free. Right? That's good for him and the ruling class. And what's good for the individual, say us today, is to be strong and healthy and not reliant on the healthcare system. And just, I don't need medications. I don't see a doctor. I don't do any of that stuff. I don't participate in the system at all. I'm terrible for the system. I don't participate in the system.
It seems like they're doing fine without you, but I understand.
Me individually. Yeah. But what if we all did it?
Right.
So you know what I mean? Like, so that's kind of the main problem is what's good for the top corporations, the top 1%, the Bill Gates of the world, is really just inherently bad for the masses, right? If they make some sort of fake meat and they actually pull it off, I still don't think they will. I think it's kind of like alchemy. I don't think you can get all the nutrition that a cow can get, right? And through nature, get into their bodies, and we can eat all that nutrition. There's so much. They've eaten hundreds and hundreds of species of plants in their life, all these biological interactions. We can't replicate that. But anyway, say we do replicate something. That's going to be good for the top 1% of people. They're going to own the patents. They're going to be distributing this all. They're going to be making all the money. And it's just going to be cheaper food for us that is just going to be unhealthy. So, again, I don't have all the answers, but we're kind of screwed no matter what because of this law of nature of what's good for the top is kind of bad for the bottom. That's
a beautiful way to look at it. And if you look at like the G7 summit where all the leaders from throughout the world meet and talk about, different aspects of the future and financial planning and whatever else, I've looked at the menus and there's been pictures leaked on the internet. Again, these are meetings talking about climate change and how terrible red meat is and you need to be on a plant-based diet. And these people are having, T-bone steaks and ribeyes and fish and all this stuff. So it's pretty paradoxical that their message is that all of the people, the working class, need to eat a plant-based diet. But when they're having these meetings, they're eating loads of meat and fish and things like that.
Yeah, I love my audience on Instagram. Food lies, by the way. But everyone's so awake to this. I post this type of stuff, and everyone, they're like, they can even say, I know some of these people. They're at home with their private chefs eating grass-fed meat. Yeah. They're not out there eating Beyond Burgers. That would be insane.
And they're also not riding their bikes to these conferences. They're flying private jets. I was in Sun Valley. There's a big meeting in Sun Valley. Zuckerberg and all these folks go out there, Bill Gates and so forth. And Sun Valley is a small town in North Idaho, and a small airport, Haley Airport. And I noticed there was just a litany of private jets there. And I knew right away that there was this annual event where a lot of Silicon Valley and private equity, venture capital type individuals, high net worth, meet there to talk about, climate change and future and things like that. And it was just so hypocritical. All these private jets, literally the entire airport, the tarmac was just loaded with these jets. And it was, as you might expect, there was a big climate push, being discussed in these, behind closed doors at this meeting. Not for them per se, but for us.
It's rules for thee, not for me. And I've heard Bill Gates quoted. He's just like, well, I'm doing a lot of good, so I can fly the private jet because I'm better than you guys, and I'm pulling all the strings and making things better, in his opinion. Yeah. Right. So I get it. This is what they think. The people, the head of Monsanto, CEO, he doesn't think he's a bad person. He thinks he's providing crops for the world. Right.
Yeah. They rationalize it in other ways. I mean, you could even look at this beautiful analogy that you just talked about. What's good for the top is not good for the working class. If you look at lockdowns, right, that was really good for the people at the top because all the tech stocks blew up. Everyone was at home ordering on Amazon or using these different platforms, Facebook, for example, social media. But they were unable to work and were unhealthy, locked indoors. There was domestic violence. There was, the children were out of school. But it certainly benefited the very wealthy. Their net worth increased dramatically, and the middle class, disproportionately was affected by that. So
And because they could still have their private chefs show up and still do their thing.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, they didn't have to eat McDonald's, but it's so funny. It's like what was open? Liquor stores and fast food.
Yeah, but you couldn't go to a gym or anything else.
It's wild.
It's wild stuff. Let's get into some specifics about meat and eating nose to tail. The correlation with nutrition and height. This is something that you've talked a lot about, and there's been some recent research, has there?
Yes. So I love this because I'm after the truth about food, what to eat, how to thrive, how to eat optimally. And that is like my biggest goal, and just try to make things simple for the masses. I'm not the PhD, I'm not, a doctor, but I can kind of interview all the best doctors and scientists, and I have for 7 years now. I've interviewed you, I've interviewed hundreds of people, right? And I'm kind of trying to put together this thesis. And so this plays in, right? So I'm gonna get there. Don't worry. This height stuff is really interesting. So you can look at a population, and we don't know that much about if they're thriving, right? Even the blue zones. We'll go to the blue zones, okay? This ties some things together because they do a lot of really great things. They are living with each other into old age, having a sense of purpose and community. They're outdoors. They are working. They're walking. They're gardening. They're moving their body, getting sunlight. They're eating real foods. All these amazing things. Yet Dan Buettner has this bias, and he says, well, it's because they're eating plant-based. So, for one, they're not. They're actually, I've been to some of the blue zones, and some of my nutrition researcher friends have been to almost all of them. And they've found the exact opposite, that they are actually animal-based by calories. So this is hard to see because if you look at a plate and it looks like there's a bunch of plants on the plate, but you realize that the fat they're using is pork fat, or they're eating eggs, they're eating cheese. These have a lot of calories. So they're actually getting the foundation of their nutrition from animal foods. And especially, I learned this in Costa Rica, one of the blue zones in the Nicoya Peninsula. And I visited this small family. We set up this whole thing, and we got to this really small little village, and the small family had almost nothing. But they had a bunch of chickens, they had some pigs, and they had some cows. So they got fresh milk every day. They're drinking raw milk. They're making cheese out of it. They're getting eggs every day, and they're killing a pig once a month maybe, right? They don't have a lot, but they're getting a lot of animal nutrition, and they're saving all of that fat. So they're cooking everything in that pork fat. So when you look at their diet, maybe they are, eating a bunch of filler foods because they don't have a lot of money. But when you look at the calories, that is a lot of animal fat. There's fat from the cheese. There's protein from the dairy. There's protein from the pork. All this stuff. So they're actually eating really, you said nose to tail, in Icaria, right? They are eating goats. They're eating lamb. They're eating nose to tail. They're eating the organs. They are not eating plant-based. So that's one thing. So I'm kind of going on a little journey here.
No, I love it.
So one thing is they are not, the animal nutrition is the foundation of any healthy diet, and it has been for all of history. Right. And I love the Weston Price stuff. Of course, about his travels 100 years ago. All these populations were eating nose to tail. They're eating eggs. They're eating dairy. They're eating seafood. They're eating organs, especially around pregnancy, giving the women this. So there's little hints of what we should be
Can we pause there? Can you expand on that? Around pregnancy, women are prioritized their nutrition?
Yes, absolutely. So this is what he found. Even with completely disconnected people, he went to like Micronesian islands, he went to Africa, went to the Swiss Alps, went to Australia. And these populations had no contact. This was 100 years ago. And they all had similar practices, especially around pregnancy, where they would be given the most nutrient-dense foods. They would be getting the raw dairy, say more of the grass-fed butter raw dairy in Switzerland, or they'd be getting the organs in all across. And so it's so interesting how these people knew, these populations knew. So we're just as smart as our ancestors, right? We just have more gadgets and gizmos now, but we have the same brains. So 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, we were just as smart. But we use that knowledge to do science by observation. And we saw that people who ate a certain way were healthier, and people who ate a different way weren't. They didn't thrive as much, right? So this is one of the things that we've kind of selected for. good nutrition. And we've learned this. This is getting more towards the height stuff. Don't worry. Right? So it's like you can see different populations eating different ways, and it changes their height. Okay? I'm going to leave that there because I have to go down another path. Is that you can look at a population, we don't know if they're thriving. Okay, that's the point. So people say, oh, well, I went vegan, or I know this vegan and they're fine. And I'm like, well, you can do anything for a year or two and be fine. That's actually how humans work, where we can adapt. So I went to Africa. I spent time with the Maasai, the Hadza, went to Uganda, and even the Pygmies. And so we kind of learned how they worked. And they were, for one, eating a whole bunch of animal foods, right? Everything they do is around getting animal nutrition, right? And that's all that they cared about, and they were eating only natural foods, right? So if there's a time where we couldn't hunt, there's natural disasters, there was the animals for some reason weren't around, all these things, we have this kind of secondary fallback plan, and we can survive on plants and tubers and whatever else we could find. And that's a great adaptation, right? That we could have this fallback plan. And we can eke out enough nutrition, and we have nutrient stores in our muscles and our organs and all of our bodies. We can have these stores. So when people go vegan, they're kind of relying on those stores because we just know scientifically that the plant foods don't have the full bioavailable and complete nutrients, proteins, vitamins, and minerals that we need. So you just looking at someone in a short term doesn't show you that much. It doesn't show you that they're thriving. There's also many smaller anecdotal stories of people who, someone just told me about this. They went vegan and their blood work looked terrible and they gained weight, and it's just like, we just know that it's not optimal. But even if someone did go vegan and lose weight, well, yes, you're eating real foods now, and it's kind of like starving while eating, I think, right? You're eating, you're just not getting all the nutrition.
Right. There's a lot of supplementation that I think people who do a vegan diet right, they know that they also need to supplement with fish oil, with zinc, with B vitamins, creatine, carnitine, right? So they inherently know that. And I've interviewed quite a few vegans who've been doing it for a while, and they admit, yeah, I do supplement with these different things. And there's a restaurant in LA. We can talk about that in a minute. But yeah, getting back to the adaptability, I think that's a really good point to drive home. And if we think about this, most of our listeners have either been to college or know someone who went to college. And most people, their freshman year, they gain 15 pounds. They're eating a very unhealthy diet. They didn't die. They didn't necessarily have a heart attack, but because they shifted their diet in maladaptive ways, their body reflected, negative changes. And some people, go to college and they party every weekend and drink 24 beers over a weekend, and they still look great, over time. So there is this variability. So I do think it's important, Brian, like you're saying, to look at thriving over time. And especially as you get older, how are people aging biologically? There's some really good evidence to suggest that having more protein might help you biologically age slower than
absolutely. Yeah. And keeping your muscle mass, and there's all this stuff. But that's a good point of, say, the guy that he's like, I just drink all day and I eat whatever I want. And for one, those people are usually in their 20s.
Yeah.
And then maybe their 30s, and you can get away with, yes, you can get away with a lot. You can get away with being vegan. You can get away with a lot of things. That doesn't mean you're thriving. And then what's going to happen long term? It's like, someone is more likely going to get some sort of chronic disease, or it's going to catch up to them at some point. So where the height studies come in is that we can learn about populations on longer term scales. And so there's a great study. There's one, it was 105 countries and correlate to height and health. And then they did, the same researchers did another study more recently. It was 150 countries. And what they found was a direct correlation. Again, we don't want to use correlations always, but you have to get all the pieces of the puzzle. So that's what I'm trying to do. Right? That's my goal in life, is for one to be in camp, no camp, which is what I said. I'm trying to be unbiased. Like, I'm looking at all the data and to figure out, well, what is the way to thrive? There is an optimal human diet. I know that. And it's varied because we're very adaptable. So depending on where you live in the world, you could have a different diet. But what is the actual optimum diet. And I interviewed a great scientist, Dr. Michael Rose. He spent 40 years at UC Davis studying this stuff. He did some really famous research on fruit flies and about aging and longevity. And he very clearly stated that the diet of any species is a diet that they lived on the longest. It's very clear. What does a panda eat? They eat these leaves, right? What does a koala eat? They eat the eucalyptus. What does a lion eat? They eat zebras. The zebras eats grass, right? This is just every species has found their diet, and it's almost like it's not even a question. It's why they exist. It's because they've eaten the correct diet their whole life, why they're thriving. And humans have that. It's just more varied, okay? So with this study about height and health, they found that it is directly linear correlated. One of the best lines of best fit I've ever seen. You look at studies, right? And there's an R value, right? It's how well the data fits the trend line. And so if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can look at a plot of all the different dots, 105 countries, imagine, and all these little dots. And they put them on a graph of animal protein, high quality protein intake and height. And you have the X and Y axis, and there's a line, and it's just completely linear up and to the right. The more animal protein they got, the taller they were, right? So perfectly correlated. But that's not all the data I'm using to make my thesis, right? It's everything. It's everything we've been talking about this whole podcast. It's everything that you and I have studied for years. It's, all of the people we know have been studying this, and we're looking at all the data. There's biochemistry, there's the food science, there's any number of studies that all line up with this. So I'm not trying to rely on this only. And it's just so perfect correlation that it kind of tells you that, okay, just because someone can avoid meat and be healthy for 5 years doesn't mean that you're correct in avoiding meat. Like, we have to look at this to understand how we can thrive for generations. And this is the second part of it, is height is correlated to health too. This study talks about it too. It's not saying that just because you're tall, you're healthy. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. And just because you're short, you're unhealthy. Absolutely not what I'm saying. And this is looking at population level data for really tens of thousands of years got us there. So people say, well, height is genetic. And I say, yes, it definitely is genetic. But how did we get those genetics? So this is really interesting, because I didn't think about this until I didn't put together the last part until recently. I was listening to Joe Rogan, and it's the second time I've heard someone bring up that there was this constriction event. There was this huge thing 70,000 years ago where we got down to only a couple thousand humans on Earth. I looked this up too to verify it. It's definitely true, right? It's like people debate over how many, but it was very small amount of people. And they look at genetics and they can tell that we all were from these people. 70,000 years ago, we all came from a small group of people, small pool of genetics. So then we went across the world from then, right? And we went to Asia and then up into the north and Africa, all these different places. And then people became different heights. So where did we get those genetics? Well, it's from our environment, and it's from our nutrition is the biggest factor in that. And so this study, or both studies, showed on a map too. So they also included a map of the world, and closer to the equator, it's low animal food, and closer to the north and some of the south, higher animal food. And that was exact correlation to height. So as you go away from the equator, you rely more on animal foods and people are taller. So again, to put it all together, it's somehow over the past 70,000 years specifically, we completely changed, and our skin colors changed, and all these things changed based on our environments and how much sun we had, right? People know probably about why we could get more or less melanin in our skin to get more vitamin D. As you know, so we go north, we're more fairer skinned. And so as we go north, these Scandinavian countries, they're the tallest, and they're eating heavily animal-based diets. So this is on thousands of generations make changes. So people in Southeast Asia are the shortest, and they're relying most on rice and just these cheap filler foods. So that's how they developed these shorter genes. So it is genetic, but it's also based on nutrition. These genetics and epigenetics
working together.
Yes. So now this like really just made everything so clear to me. It's like the last piece of the puzzle. So even if you show me some group of people that have eaten kind of vegetarian for their life or 10 years or even 3 generations, that doesn't mean that much to me when you're asking what is human thriving, because you have to look at this, and there's great data to show that, again, not just because you're tall means you're healthy. It just means that for thousands of generations, you got full nutrition to reach your full height potential and be the best human you can be. Again, I don't want to make fun of short people. This is absolutely not that. And it really tells you a lot about what the optimum diet is.
It's super fascinating because if you think about like a Scandinavian restaurant or Icelandic food, it is a lot of nose to tail. There's an Icelandic restaurant in Seattle, and it's like bone-in ribeye and all sorts of offal and different parts of organ meats and things like that. And if you think about Scandinavian people, if you look at the strongman competition, most of those individuals have some Icelandic genes and so forth. And to your point, if you think about Filipinos, for example, or someone from Southeast Asia, and I've been to Indonesia, Bali, and things, a lot of rice being consumed. I didn't see any cattle when I was out there. A lot of chicken, and people would consume the whole chicken. In Asia, you'll see families on a scooter, and in the back will be one chicken for dinner for the family and things like that. But a lot more rice and ube, is it?
That's just sweet potato. Yeah, it's kind of a purple sweet potato. Yeah, kind of thing. Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting.
But there's more. This study actually showed that there's a negative correlation, as in the more rice you eat and grains, you actually get shorter. So to me, it's not that eating rice causes shortness. It's that it's the composition of your diet matters. So if you're filling your calories with pretty much empty calories, low protein content, not bioavailable protein, over time you're just shorter. And every way you cut the data, it comes true. And then there's another completely different study that I don't remember the details, but it looks at a bunch of countries, and there's stunting in children, right? Have you heard of this study? Stunting in children, and the people with the lowest meat intake, it's stunted growth, right? They are actually hindered in their growth. So that's another part of it, is that it's not that you just eat animal foods and become tall. It's that you need animal nutrition to reach your full height potential. Yeah. And so now some of these people, as people get more wealth and they can afford more meat, they're actually getting taller in their family, right? They're like, I'm taller than my mom and dad, and they don't know why. Well, I think your mom and dad they grew up maybe in the Great Depression, or they grew up without a lot of good nutrition, and now your genetics are still in there, and epigenetics you're able to express these genes, that if you ate enough quality animal nutrition to reach your full height.
Yeah, and also on the other side of the coin, if you will, birth rates and infant survivability is correlated with meat intake. There was that study, I can't remember the exact title, but it was something of an analysis of 175 countries, contemporary countries, looking at birth rates and longevity and age of death and things. And animal meat and higher proportions of calories from animals was linked with greater life expectancy and lower childhood mortality. So yeah, we have pretty good evidence now to, again, talk about, well, what is ideal for humans? Like probably a nose to tail omnivorous style diet.
That's it. Yeah, and so your body doesn't care what the name of your diet is. So it just wants nutrients, it wants protein, and it wants the right amount of energy. So here's another one of my little spiels that I've learned along the way, and we'll put in the series in a really easy to understand way, where you don't have to get into the diet wars. You can just realize that your best diet doesn't need a name, and it's kind of the composition of it over time. It's having a high nutrient density. It's having, a foundation of animal foods with whole foods on the side. And so I like to say food is 4 things. It's protein, it's nutrients, it's vitamins and minerals, right? Nutrients, it's fats, and it's carbs. So it's just kind of general high level. So the protein and vitamins and minerals, those are your nutrients. Those are your building blocks. That's a foundation. Fats and carbs are mostly just energy, although we know there's essential fats and all that stuff. But so it's nutrients and energy. Most people are getting far too few nutrients and too much energy, right? And they are becoming overweight. They are getting type 2 diabetes. This is just a consequence of low nutrient, high energy diets. For all of history, we got the right amount of nutrients, right? We got all the good protein, bioavailable protein, vitamins, and minerals from a foundation of animal foods wherever we were in the world, right? We're highly adaptable. Like we said, we ate different things. So in the north, maybe we had elk and deer and giant animals, and there weren't that many plants around. And then maybe around the equator, we were getting more smaller animals, but we were eating whole foods on the side. We were eating eggs, and we were eating like lizards and turtles, right? So we were getting all the nutrients we needed, and we're getting the right amount of energy because the food wasn't processed. So if you eat whole foods, you're probably going to get the right amount of fats and carbs, the energy to get you through the day. But once you start processing foods, the whole nutrient to energy ratio gets skewed. So that's really one of the big problems of processed foods. It's not, there's many problems, right? We talked about the glyphosate, we talked about added ingredients, preserved, blah, blah, million things. But you could really just look at the poor nutrient to energy ratio, which is kind of just nutrient density. And you're really kind of screwed if you're eating processed foods, because you're just not going to be able to get the correct nutrients and the right amount of energy your body needs. You're always going to get too much energy. No one got fat by eating too many nutrients. And I'm counting protein as a nutrient, right? It's kind of the way to lose weight it's kind of the opposite. It's like to lose weight, you eat more protein, more nutrients, and less energy. And every bodybuilder knows this. What do they do to cut? They're still eating high protein, but they'll go low carb and low fat at the same time. That's the cutting diet, and it sucks, and it's not fun. But you're eating high nutrient, low energy. So it really clicked into place for me when you realize you don't have to have a name for your diet. You don't have to, get into the diet wars. Like I said, just you have to understand the basics of this concept. Although, I don't know, maybe it's just too nerdy if we're talking about nutrients to energy. We need to give it to people in a way that's easier to understand. And so if they say, okay, nutrient to energy, I kind of get it. I get what you're saying. So what do I eat? Well, again, you eat whole foods. You have the foundation of animal foods, and then you have whole foods on the side, and you're probably gonna get it correct. And there's these great researchers, Robbenheimer and Simpson. If you come across these guys, they created the protein leverage hypothesis. Okay. Yeah. So of course you've heard the protein leverage hypothesis. So Robbenheimer and Simpson are behind that. So they have been doing studies for decades, and they found every animal they studied follows this. Down to they started with locusts, and then they went up to and did even studies in humans. So they found that all animals require a certain amount of protein, and if you change their feed, like in the lab, and you give them a lower protein diet with higher fats or carbs, right? Doesn't matter. It's energy. They will overeat to get the same amount of protein, right? So if rodent studies, take mice, you have this rodent feed. It's say 12% protein, and that's what mice need. You give them a pellet, right? And it's 12% protein, and it has fats and carbs. They eat it. They're the normal weight. They live the normal size. They reproduce normally. Then you take this, you split them into two groups. You have a different feed that's just say 9% protein, and then of course it has to have more fats and carbs. And that group ate more, right? And they became fat. They had less offspring, and they died earlier. And they did the math, and they're like, okay, what did they eat? Well, yes, they ate more calories, but they ate more calories of energy, fats and carbs, right? And what they actually ate the same amount of protein as the other group. So that they could see, okay, so these mice, their bodies needed this certain amount of protein, so they ate more because of this is like a proxy for processed foods, basically, is they had to eat more of them to get the same amount of protein. So now, this is why I've been doing this for 10 years, 7 years full time. And then the world kind of makes sense, right? You're like, okay, so we're just after the nutrients. If you mess with that ratio, if you decouple from nature, you're going to end up getting the wrong ratio, and you're going to end up eating too much. So I kind of go against the calorie bros a lot online, because they're just like, oh, it's just about a calorie deficit. Like, this is not helpful for anyone. You're just telling someone to create a calorie deficit. It's just like telling someone to be rich. Just make more money, dummy.
Right, just spend less. Like, come on, it's so easy.
Yeah. So, it's like, well, so this tells you how. This tells you how to do it, and it gives you more information. It's like, okay, you're not just trying to eat less. You're trying to get more nutrients for less calories. And that's what I do. So every time I eat a meal, like, how am I going to get enough protein and nutrients? And also, I don't stop at protein. A lot of the lifter bros, they're just like eating egg whites and chicken breasts. Like, that's not enough good quality nutrients. I'm eating oysters. I'm eating organ meat sometimes. I'm eating eggs. There's a lot more nutrients in there. So if you think about it this way, you will actually have practical information on how to eat less. And there's a satiety factor too. I'm really into the satiety. It's like, why do people gain weight? No one wants to eat too much, yet they do. Well, it factors into satiety. It's if you eat the wrong foods, if you're eating low nutrient foods with high energy, then your body is just going to be hungry like the mice, and you're going to end up eating more. So that's why I feel bad for these people, because they're trying. It's not that it's a lack of willpower. It's not like you've seen the graphs where it's in 1980, the obesity just skyrockets. It's not that in 1980, everyone just decided to be a slob and lose all their willpower. It's in 1980s when this big influx of processed foods like really took place, and the dietary guidelines came, and the big base of the empty calories, empty energy, bread, pasta, all this stuff, empty calories. That's going to throw off your nutrient to energy ratio. You're just going to have to eat more. So, man, everything just clicked into place when I figured this stuff out.
Well, it makes so much sense. And I think intuitively most people know this. If you were to have a bunch of mac and cheese or pasta with no protein, usually it's not very satiating or filling, and you want more food after the fact. You might crave ice cream. You might crave more bread or sweets after dinner. So I think, shifting, even if you are vegan or vegetarian, having much higher protein, prioritizing protein, because it helps inherently satiate your appetite. And we can get into the mechanisms here. Protein affects GLP-1 and these different incretin gut hormones. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects, but once I started to really dive into the protein leverage hypothesis, and there's been a lot of recent studies that have really corroborated with this hypothesis, suggesting that really in humans, this plays a big role in appetite and satiety. And so I think it's really important, especially for kids too, who are constantly snacking and building and developing muscles and bones, that you front load their nutrition with protein. You look at obese children, they're eating these micronutrient devoid and protein devoid foods. It's Pop-Tarts, it's bagels, with cream cheese or whatever, chips. I mean, and then you see childhood obesity just skyrocket. So yeah, it doesn't seem very hard to me, but going back to I think the food industry has a lot of influence over the dietetic field. And then so many people that are mainstream proponents of the energy balance model. And of course, I don't think you can overeat calories perpetuity and still be lean. Obviously, energy balance does matter. But it seems that they have a very biased mindset, because they are influenced by the very industry that is making the foods that have nutrition labels, right? You eat a ribeye steak, you don't know how many calories are in that or how much protein. You're like, I'm full, I'm satiated naturally. So I think, it behooves, or it benefits the food industry to shift people to focus on labels and this whole nutritionism aspect of food. And of course, we know the industry is paying the dietitians to tell people, hey, look, it's okay, sprinkle, wheat thins on your salad, or, there's this, I think her name is like the cancer dietitian, and she's promoting corn oil, promoting Pop-Tarts, soda. It's just insane. And then this, the story, the Washington Post broke this story about how the food industry is paying these dietitians. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, it all makes sense. It goes along with the whole thing of you follow the money, but they're all working in the just calorie in, calorie out paradigm. So my paradigm, and probably everyone we know, is very different from the calorie paradigm. It's kind of the nutrient density paradigm, right? With even if they don't know it, pretty much everyone I've talked to in our space gets it, that it's not about calories, it's about the quality of food. And so if you're stuck in the calorie paradigm, well, that's what the processed food industry wants you to be stuck in the calorie paradigm, because then Coca-Cola even paid the energy consortium balance. Have you heard of the energy consortium balance? It's like this whole thing that Coca-Cola helped fund that just said, and Gatorade, I think, that if you just You just need to work out more, and then it won't matter if you drink Coke or Gatorade because it's just about calorie balance, right? So there's a lot of incentive for the big food systems to just make you think it's all about calories. But I'm saying there's nutrient calories and energy calories. One you want more of, one you want less of. This is a totally different paradigm that they're completely missing. And they're missing it on purpose because the money is in missing this. So if you could just wake up to this one thing, if I could have the magic wand, well, Food Lies is going to be that magic wand when it comes out, is that if people could understand this part, oh, there's completely different types of calories. I want more of one and less of the other. If I do this, then yes, I do want people to eat less calories. I want people to eat less energy calories, less empty calories. My mom taught me this. Like, don't eat empty calories. Don't drink soda. It's empty calories. I've been in this 10 years and it comes back to almost just that. So you have to understand the difference. So if people just arbitrarily eat fewer calories, calorie restrict, you're going to be getting less nutrients, less protein, less nutrients if you're arbitrarily just cutting all calories. And that's the opposite of what you want to do. And they have studies to show this too. If people eat less, they're just arbitrarily eating less, they actually lose muscle too, right? So the Ozempic stuff too, they're eating less, they're losing their muscle mass. This is terrible. Now you're lowering your metabolic rate. This is why people bounce back and gain more weight later. It's because you need muscle mass. The number one thing you want to maintain when you're losing weight is your muscle mass.
Right. Well, to that point, there was a recently published study in the fall of 2023 that found that mortality was strongly tethered. And this was using, I can't remember if it was the Nurses Health data or NHANES data, but mortality is tightly correlated over time with protein consumption as a proportion of calorie intake. Mm-hmm. And there was this curve, kind of a J-shaped type curve, and the more protein that people consumed was tethered with greater life expectancy and reduced mortality as a percentage of calories, which speaks to exactly what you just said in other terms. And in that study, they also found that higher percentage of calories from carbohydrates was strongly linked proportionally with greater odds of dying from all causes, and especially cancer. And so I think, if you just focus on this calorie thing and getting energy balance, it doesn't matter where your macros are coming from, as long as you're in a deficit, blah, blah, then it doesn't really send the right message. And it's actually, to be totally fair, not totally science-based if you start to look at these other studies. It's one thing to focus on weight loss, but we also want to optimize longevity and reduce risk of all these different diseases, right? It's why just lose weight and then die from something else? So I think we need to look at a bigger picture. And so I think this reductionistic mindset really caught it, like you said, that's where the money is. Mm-hmm. And so I think when you understand, and again, you look at these epidemiological studies or studies on looking at PUFA consumption coming from seed oils. Oftentimes, it's from the Canola Society, or there's different groups that have a vested interest in normalizing the consumption of these different products.
It's so good. The weight loss stuff is another really good point. You can lose weight on any diet. I've said this from day one. People try to fight back with me like, yo, bro, like there's a professor that ate Twinkies and lost weight, the Twinkie diet. Yeah. I'm like, yeah, I use that as to make my points, is that you can lose weight on any diet. That doesn't tell you if it's healthy or not. And the professor said it was miserable. He felt terrible. There's all these negative side effects. Yes, of course. But you need to look beyond that. That's why we're zooming out. I want to find the theory of everything. It's like, what is the theory of everything? It equals MC squared. And in the nutrition world, it is kind of this nutrient to energy ratio. You said, the studies you brought up prove the same thing. If you're looking at it, that kind of is the nutrient composition of a diet. If you're looking at the protein to carb or calorie, makeup of the diet, that yes.
Yeah. Well, we can keep going down this path. I think there's one more study I wanted to mention, and then we can talk about the seed oils, because this is controversial. But going back to, there was a study that just came out several weeks ago looking at strontium and zinc radioisotopes in dental enamel in ancestral humans in the Morocco region of North Africa. And the way that I found how I got a hold of the study was actually through a vegan website. It was really interesting. And essentially the diet wars, everyone has their biases. I have my biases as well. The vegans were saying, humans didn't eat that much. Ancestral hunter-gatherer tribes didn't eat that much meat. They had plants as well. But it dovetails into what you talked about earlier, that humans are very adaptable. So during the wintertime, perhaps, where there was a shortage of big game or sheep, then maybe humans would have more acorns in this part of North Africa. But essentially what this study found is using dental enamel, looking at zinc and strontium, radioisotopes and so forth, they were able to find that humans are omnivores. They ate meat and flesh, and they could tell by the collagen that it wasn't coming from, there was a certain element that was coming from sheep. They were able to figure out through some analysis. But anyway, it was interesting how this vegan blogger was like, see, humans, we don't really need that much meat, guys. Like, look, like this study just found, but if you actually read the study, it was like, it supported what we're talking about, a whole food omnivore style diet. And some of the plant matter was coming from acorns and nuts and seeds and things like that, and other tubers that were probably seasonally available, which I think is another thing that we haven't yet talked about that is really important. Seasonality here is really, and if you think about eating optimally in North America, especially if you live north of San Francisco or Atlanta, Georgia, during the winter, there's no, mangoes growing, or pineapple or what have you. As much as I do love those fruits in season, that's not growing between October and March, So I think people should also consider that aspect of it.
Yeah, and there's other studies that looked at some of the ancestors in Europe that were highly meat-based too. And this was probably more people that were in like kind of the Ice Age time. And even if it was plant-based for half the diet, I mean, really, but by calories, it's probably because animal foods, have so many more calories from fat that it actually is a foundation of animal foods. It doesn't matter to me, right? That's why I'm not in the diet wars. I've never been carnivore. I've tried it for a couple of weeks. It doesn't offend me to know that we ate plant foods. Great, yes, it's a whole foods foundation of animal foods always, and whole foods, great.
Yeah, I love that message. Yeah, there is a lot of clickbaity thing. I think there's a certain level of attraction to the idea that all plants are bad and they're meant to kill you and things like that. I have a garden, I grow vegetables, and I've had carnivore doctors over and stuff like that. And they're like, I like what you're doing here outside of that. And I'm like, but that is part of the ecosystem, because the chickens in the winter will sort of naturally till the soil, and their manure or poop we spread around, and it adds more nitrogen back. And there's a lot of different, I think we should be eating, some people should be eating plants, It can be boring just having ribeyes all the time, as much as I love them. But I've worked with clients, and they get bored. They might lose some weight, and they improve aspects of their health. Their arthritis or GI issues generally will be in remission after going carnivore. But it's hard to sustain that for some people. While some people just thrive on it. They don't mind. Like Sean Baker, he's ribeye once or twice a day. He's good, right? Good. But not everyone's like that.
Yes, you have to make it approachable for everyone. And I still will push back against Sean Baker. I saw him do a video, and he's like, oh, well, I tried to eat some apples, and it didn't work for me. Like, well, yeah, if you're going carnivore for like 9 years and you eat some apples, it's not going to do well in your digestive system, right? You lost all these bacteria that are going to break them down. So you got to make it approachable for people. You got to make it, we always had plant foods. And I get it. I am very into the anti-nutrient stuff.
Yeah.
I 100% know what they're talking about. I actually had a problem with oxalates. I was drinking kale and spinach and almond milk shakes for years in the beginning of my health journey, and I thought I was doing so great. And then I was doing it for years and years, high oxalate. Then I had terrible skin problems, and then I stopped doing it, and I lost like 10 pounds. It was crazy. Like, I was already healthy, and I thought I was so good and feeling good, and then I stopped. And all this kind of inflammation went away. I lost all this body fat, probably lots of visceral fat. My skin problems started going away. And so then I realized it's not serving you to eat. There is more, yes, there's more nuance. And so, yes, I don't eat lots of nuts and seeds and leaves, right? I don't eat that stuff anymore. Not saying that you can never eat them, but we should be able to eat them. I want to be anti-fragile. And I don't think that just eating, a few nuts once in a while is going to kill me. And I know that there maybe is some things that aren't ideal, but we've co-evolved with these foods, and we've been eating them, and maybe it's some hormetic stress that we need. Maybe, maybe it's just good to have some of these sometimes, or they have some other nutrients. Or even, I'm not into the fiber thing at all, right? And there's two types of fiber. There's insoluble and soluble fiber, and I don't think it's necessary to have a bunch of roughage in your diet. I think that's this old myth. People are like, oh, how am I going to go to the bathroom if I'm not eating fiber? Well, Sean Baker. Right. You know what I mean? Like all the carnivores I know are very regular. It's all good. You know what I mean? You do not need fiber. But there's some soluble fiber that could feed your gut bacteria. And yes, there's good things, and I understand, and I eat fruit, and it's all good. But my thing with the fiber, or the story behind this, is there's also this aspect of volume of food. This gets into the satiety thing a little bit, and this also gets into why whole foods are good. Is I eat pickles and fruit and sauerkraut and stuff like that. Simple stuff. I'm not eating all the nuts, seeds, and leaves, right? Pickles, sauerkraut, fruit. Let's stick there. That has some soluble fiber. That does have some insoluble fiber. But it's good. I'm getting other nutrients. I'm getting probiotics. I'm getting vitamin C. I'm getting some other stuff, and likely it's good. But also it's providing volume of food too. All humans eat. There's this one study. It was kind of like humans eat 3 to 5 pounds of food per day, depending on your size. So I think a lot of people have problems. I run into a lot of people that had problems on carnivore, and they gained weight because they could eat too much. They're eating cream and cheese and butter, all this stuff. You can gain weight on carnivore because you can eat too many calories. Not empty, but you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of fat calories. And yes, you could gain weight from fat. Sorry, guys. That can't happen. Just because you're carnivore doesn't mean you're healthy. So a good little trick for some people, and I've helped people with their diet, adding in pickles. Are pickles going to kill you? You know what I mean? Well, this is a perfectly okay food. They're low anti-nutrient, provides volume of food so that you can be full. And it provides short-term satiety. It's not like long-term satiety comes from protein and fat. Short-term satiety, which basically we have stomach stretching sensors in our stomach that can tell like when we're done eating. And so it can help a lot of people to just eat some of these foods. There's like almost no calories in pickles or sauerkraut, but it's good flavor, it's extra nutrients, and it can kind of fill you up in the short term so that protein and fat can carry you in the long term. So I saw people say, oh, well, then why are all these studies like fiber people? There's like, all the studies show, epidemiology, right? Observational kind of stuff show that people who eat more fruits and vegetables or more fiber are healthier. Like, well, one thing, that's a proxy for eating less processed foods. If you're eating more fiber, that means you're eating less processed foods, right? You're eating more whole foods. That's a good thing always. So yes, I do agree that if you eat more whole foods, you'll be healthier because it goes back to nutrient to energy ratio. It's a lot of water even. I have this thing now where it's like you don't want to eat dry foods. All the processed foods are really just dry foods, a bunch of pasta, breads, all this stuff that's just kind of ground up and put back together. That's, I think, why people just overeat over time. Like I said, no one wants to overeat, yet they do. Well, why is that? Because you're getting extra energy, calories, from carbs or fats over time without your body knowing, right? So it's if you eat whole foods in a whole form, you're getting a bunch of water, fiber, but I don't think fiber is magic. Does that make sense? Like the fiber
Totally.
isn't the magic part. The magic is you're eating whole foods.
I love that. No, and there's really good studies from gastroenterology clinics finding that high fiber diets are linked with increased prevalence of gastrointestinal symptoms, whether it's constipation, diarrhea, or tenesmus, the inability to control your bowels. You get the urge and you just have to go right away. And what was interesting, speaking about people's biases, is these studies would have instruct people. They came into the GI clinic. This was a 2-year follow-up study of like 46 different individuals. And about 10% of the people, despite their symptoms resolving, GI issues, constipation, tenesmus, they went back on a high fiber diet and they were followed after, and their symptoms reappeared, but they still wanted to eat a high fiber diet. And that is how pervasive this myth or this sort of adage, if you will, that fiber is so good for you because of epidemiological studies. I think it's interesting. I mean, when you think about fiber, it's more like traffic on a freeway. How does improving your gastrointestinal health benefit by having more cars on the road? It's just more bulk matter that you need to break down. I understand the satiety aspect that you mentioned. And
it's more than water, I think, really.
Yeah.
It's just, it's in its whole form.
It's fascinating. But going back to the fermented vegetables, I think that's a really important point, something that is probably under-recognized in terms of nutrition. And speaking of ancestral humans, it makes a lot of sense. You know, these tubers and root vegetables or cabbage coming available during a finite time of the year, and you want to preserve your harvest, so you ferment it. It really makes sense. You go to Asia, before and after meals in South Korea, there's kimchi. being consumed in other parts of the world. So I think that makes a lot of sense, and I eat a lot of fermented foods for that reason. I think they taste good too.
It's great.
Yeah.
You want to enjoy every meal. Mark Sisson taught me this a long time ago. I enjoy every bite of food, every single bite of food, and it's kind of our birthright as humans. You don't want to be stuck on some low-calorie, weird diet and salads with no dressing and stuff like that. And you and we're about to enjoy a meal together right after this. We are going to enjoy it.
Yes.
We're going to be eating some grass-fed beef. We're going to be eating whole foods. We're going to be eating all the things we just talked about. And that's super enjoyable, has the correct nutrient density. It's going to keep us full, and it's sustainable for life.
Love that. Before we part ways and have that wonderful meal that I'm looking forward to, and eating together, I think it's really important. There are studies in looking at obesity rates in families. Families that eat together generally have lower body fat percentage and BMIs compared to families who just have TV dinners and everyone does their own thing. So I think eating together, I think, is really important. But getting back to the seed oils, I've done a lot of research into the history of cottonseed oil. And it took 90 years for us to figure out that, wow, these trans fats that help preserve these polyunsaturated fats in cottonseed, the oil that's really a waste product, these cotton seeds, is harmful. We're now consuming way more canola oil and soybean oil than ever in human history. What are your thoughts? I know you've interviewed some people and talked about this. It's controversial because if you look at some long-term studies or epidemiological studies, people will say, well, if you replace saturated fat with PUFAs, the polyunsaturated linoleic acid found in cotton, canola, soy, rapeseed, and sunflower oil, there's a reduction in heart disease. It benefits cardiovascular outcomes. So it doesn't make sense to minimize these. But what are your thoughts on that?
I'm fascinated by this, and I've tried to talk to tons of people about this and figured out. So Lane Norton is one of these guys that posts about this, and I've had a long history with Lane Norton, friends and enemies and frenemies. No, we're cool now, and he's actually in the Food Lies series.
Nice.
So he's one of these people that pointed out, and I get it. But you know what? These people died of other things. So there's different studies. So they had less heart disease, but they had greater mortality from other problems, more cancer, stuff like that. So I think that's part of it, right? Is that they're looking at the endpoint of just heart attacks. And if you look at that, then maybe it can be okay. But for other things, it's not as good. I think there's part of it is that no one eats a good diet. Like we said, maybe less than 1% eat a good diet. So if you're studying a bunch of people, yes, people who eat more meat and more saturated fat, they're also eating more French fries and sodas. And so it's just dirty data. Like no one's really eating the correct way. If you look at our pals in Austin and all around the world that eat like we do, very small amount of people, I think you would find a lot different, that you would find that we will live longer. You look at the people who live long. These are the people that grew up on farms eating real foods and real fats. So that's part of it. I think the oxidation is a big part of it. I just read Dr. Kate's third book. Dr. Kate Shanahan's an OG. I'm reading Dr. Georgia Eads' book right now too. So they're talking about a lot of this and all this data and how we got here. And I think that the oxidation is a part of it, that the seed oils, they're just way more prone to oxidation. And I think Dr. Kate's got this kind of like her theory of everything is kind of the reactive, like ROS theory of aging disease is just about oxidation, right? And anything like smoking, it's this whole like pathway of oxidizing your LDL, and that's the problem, right? So whether it's from smoking you get oxidized LDL and then you get heart disease, or whether it's from the seed oils and frying them and then too much of them, we've never had this amount of seed oils in our diet too, that's really the problem. So it's the oxidation of them, and basically.
I love that. I haven't thought about the idea that these people are dying from other causes, and that is sort of obfuscating the research to make it appear as though they are cardioprotective. That is so fascinating. I need to really dive into that, because there's several large studies that have looked at outcomes and looking at percentage of fatty acids. And I'm not sure if they're looking at red blood cell, EPA, DHA, and linoleic acid, but I do find oftentimes, honestly, Brian, you look at the disclosures and conflicts of interest, and someone, at least one or two researchers, is on an advisory board for either canola, cottonseed, or some other, there's like I can't remember the conglomerate, but it's like a canola oil foundation, something to that effect. And so it just, makes me a little bit more question the research validity, because when you have these other observational studies that look at markers of inflammation, comparing omnivores versus vegetarians, and then looking at the proportion of linoleic acid and arachidonic acid in their red blood cells, it's pretty clear that the omnivores have much lower levels of linoleic acid and arachidonic acid in their red blood cells, and higher levels of health-promoting EPA and DHA and their associated metabolic products, these so-called pro-resolving mediators. And the vegans had none, literally none. This was a study in the UK. Sadly, it's only been cited 17 times. But in my opinion, this is really important because it speaks to what I wanted to finish up on was the mental health aspect. Because obviously it's no surprise here in this country and throughout the world, we're seeing riots, protests, suicides, violence. And it's hard to make the argument that that is not tethered to poor food choices and consumption.
I definitely think it is. I think that's the base of it. That's why I'm reading Dr. Georgia Ead's new book. She's a psychiatrist. She's from Harvard. Yeah. And her whole book is about how our diet affects our mental health. And it's basically type 2 Alzheimer's, type 3 diabetes. Like a lot of these things come down to get your blood-brain barrier and like getting your brain to run on glucose or ketones. Yeah. And if you are eating this poor diet, you're going to disrupt that and eventually cause problems. And, that's my story with my mom. And so I think it's huge. It's huge. And I haven't looked into the science on all of this stuff because it's hard to do the science on like your diet compared with mental disease. But Dr. Georgia Ead's doing it. And I suggest people read her new book. It's Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. And you'll learn more about this. And people I know anecdotally who change their diet, they have very improved mental health. Oh, yeah. And exercise, too. Of course, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the evenness in mood, the changes in blood sugar, obviously there's a lot of different reasons why that may be, but we talked about the high nutrient density in an omnivorous style diet, creatine, carnitine, zinc, B12, all these different nutrients, choline. These are things that you're not getting in a vegetarian-based diet. And then if you just look anecdotally of the viral videos in grocery stores where you have activists pouring milk out and throwing cheese around and stuff, you don't see omnivores doing that, throwing broccoli around. I've never seen a viral video of an omnivore just taking a, vegan patty and throwing it. Yeah. And so you just sort of, with your own eyes, without science, can see that there are mental challenges linked. There's a difference in, I would say, cognitive resilience. If I want to be just very unbiased here, cognitive resilience in people who eat an omnivore diet versus one that is more heavily processed. And sadly, not to pick on whole food-based vegetarians or vegans, but most people that go vegan or vegetarian, a super majority of their calories come from processed food. That's just unarguable. And so I think we're just seeing that, unfortunately, many more people are now eating that way, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah, and maybe to wrap it up at the end here, visiting Africa, not that I could see that much. I only spent time with these hunter-gatherers and these people out in the villages for so long, but they were eating real foods only. They were having animal-based foods. They were some of the most calm, collected, mentally stable. It was just a completely different ball game. And so, yeah, I just think in all the things we've talked about, if you just go back to our roots, just live more like a human. I call it sapien. That's my whole thing. We're about to go to the Sapien Center here in Austin. After this, it's a bunch of people living closer to nature, closer to how we should live, having community, eating whole foods, moving, sunlight, sleep. That's all you need. Yeah, I love that. Brian, so the documentary and the series is coming out relatively soon. Where can people learn more about that? Just search Food Lies wherever we go. That's the easiest way. I'm on Instagram a lot. Food Lies. You can go on YouTube, find the Food Lies intro. It's a really good 3.5-minute intro. And yeah, we're just trying to, we just got a bunch of big funding. And so we're going to be able to finish it. And it's super high quality. It's a hard thing to do. Oh, yeah. Right? You see these Netflix productions. I don't know if we're going to go on Netflix. We're going to go somewhere big and maybe go direct to consumer first. But it's going to be a 6-part series. It's going to be very high quality. I can show you episode 1 in a private screening link. Sure. And we are going to make big waves. I love that. Let's finish off up on a former vegetarian restaurateur in Santa Monica who decided to offer regenerative meat in her restaurant.
She's a friend of yours. The blowback, I immediately saw it on Instagram. I have some vegan friends who are now having more raw milk and things like that, who actually sent it to me, like, and that was eye-opening for them to see the reaction here. If folks haven't heard of this, I think they should.
Yeah, Chef Molly, she had Sage Restaurant Bistro. Her family had the biggest famous restaurant, vegan restaurants ever, Cafe Gratitude. So she grew up in this very vegan household, and she just completely changed, and she's just realized it was all a scam. She's speaking out on it. She has her own regenerative ranch here in Texas.
Wow.
And so, yeah, support her, Sage Bistro. There's like a farm to table regenerative restaurant now. And yeah, just one of these millions and millions of success stories. I don't know if it's millions, but there's so many that I hear of people just kind of going back to meat, understanding that there's a big scam out there trying to blame meat for all our problems. And she's back on Team Meat.
But I mean, the blowback that she received was just like,
it was crazy,
disproportionate to what she's doing. I mean, just people are picketing and throwing things, calling her a liar, and she was just like, "Hey, I changed my diet, like, and I want to help other people do the same thing. Like, we still offer vegan food if you want it."
Maybe that is part of the mental aspect to it, right? It's just, I don't know.
Yeah, it's wild. So her family is part of Cafe Gratitude.
Yeah, her parents. Yeah,
amazing.
And the dad was eating fish the whole time too.
No way. Okay.
Yeah, that was a big scandal that broke, and you can look up those news stories.
Yeah. I used to frequent when I was really into more plant-based dieting back in 2006. I would go in the early 2000s. They were big in the Bay Area where I lived, and I quite liked their restaurants. But they had one in San Rafael, and they had some sort of class action lawsuit. An employee sued, and they had to close one. There's still one in Santa Monica, I believe, and then one in San Francisco. But it's wild. So, Brian, really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you so much. And if folks want to listen to your podcast, what is a great episode they should start out with?
Oh, man. Yeah, it's called Peak Human. I mentioned the one with Dr. Michael Rose. Another interesting one, Dr. David Klurfeld. He was on the WHO committee in 2015 that decided red meat was a carcinogen. I think I have the only interview with him. He had to get special clearance. And he said it was a big setup. It was a bunch of vegans. And that he was bringing studies to the table showing that red meat is perfectly healthy. And they got rid of them. It's crazy. And I still think I'm the only one that interviewed him.
Oh, I'm going to listen to that on my drive home.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome. Brian, appreciate you coming on the show.
Oh, man. Mike, thanks so much.